From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. Look, I know there's been a lot of doom and gloom in the news lately. But guess what? Today, we're serving you a little bit of sunshine. The solar industry has been sparking a quiet revolution in the energy sector. It's a revolution that fossil fuel giants do not want you to know about. But it is here, and it's almost unstoppable. Today on Lever Time, I talk to the legendary author and journalist who sounded the first alarms about climate change. He has a hopeful message about the solar revolution that's taking hold of the world. Why aren't we hearing very much about this incredible transformation? And how is this solar revolution accelerating despite the best efforts of the Trump administration to try to crush it? We're going to answer those questions and more on today's episode.
I speak for the trees. Let them grow. Let them grow.
When I was a child, I loved Dr. Seuss books. But this was the one that always freaked me out, the Lorax.
I'll yell and I'll shout for the fine things on earth that are on their way out.
I vividly remember this 1970s cartoon version of the Lorax from television. It had this zany music underneath this genuinely disturbing story about industry refusing to listen to those warning of our impending ecological demise.
They say I'm old-fashioned and live in the past, but sometimes I think progress progresses too fast.
54 years after the Lorax was first published, it can often feel these days like that book predicted what would happen to our planet, especially when it comes to climate change. And through much of that journey, we've gotten warning after warning from a real-life Lorax, the journalist Bill McKibben, who has often delivered the very bad news and sounded the alarms that we all need to hear.
I wrote the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect back in the 1980s. So I've been on this for a very long time and the bearer of a lot of bad news over the years.
So when Bill published his newest book, I was ready for another installment in his Lorax tale. Except this time, he has some good news. In fact, that's an understatement. He has news that's made me feel more optimistic than I have, maybe since I was a little kid reading The Cat in the Hat.
95% of new generating capacity around the world last year was clean energy, including in the U.S., including in Texas, which is building this faster than any place else in the country.
According to Bill McKibben, amid all of the terrible environmental policies and climate denialism of the Trump administration, the clean energy revolution has reached a critical tipping point where the energy market is fundamentally changing.
It's not the Whole Foods of energy anymore, nice but pricey. It's the Costco of energy. It's cheap, it's available in bulk, it's on the shelf ready to go.
And Bill McKibben would know. He's been investigating and reporting on climate change for decades.
So I'm enjoying, amidst all the big bad things happening on planet Earth and in America right now, to get to spread the news of the one, I think, good big thing also going on at the same time.
McKibben's new book is called Here Comes the Sun, A Last Chance for the Climate and a Fresh Chance for Civilization. He's also helping to organize a grassroots effort, fittingly called Sunday. This Sunday, September 21st, grassroots organizers and solar energy advocates are gathering in demonstrations across the country to send a message to America's leaders. It's time to scale up solar energy or fall behind the rest of the world. Consider what's been happening on the other side of the globe. In just the first 5 months of 2025, China installed around 198 gigawatts of solar power. That's the equivalent of enough annual electricity to power the entire country of India. The pace of China's solar development is mind-boggling. The Chinese are installing almost 100 solar panels per second. Meanwhile, recyclable lithium batteries are getting cheaper and more efficient, increasing our ability to store that energy being captured from the sun. All of this electricity can power more and more of humanity's transportation system, in part because electric vehicles are so efficient. Get this, electric vehicles need roughly half the power to go the same distance as gas-powered vehicles. That's because gas-powered cars are wildly inefficient, wasting around 80% of the fossil fuel in their tanks and generating unnecessary heat in the process. Over the past 5 years, geopolitical instability from authoritarian regimes, particularly Russia's war in Ukraine, pushed gas prices to an all-time high in 2022. Now, Donald Trump has promised to help oil tycoons tap into America's so-called liquid gold by accelerating fossil fuel pipeline development and drilling.
Drill, baby, drill.
But the current profit margins of oil are simply not incentivizing as many new drilling projects as the fossil fuel industry would like. At the same time, a recent federal report found that oil prices are starting to rise again. So fossil fuels are burning up the climate and torching your wallet, all while solar energy is getting cheaper. Right about now, you may be thinking, okay, yeah, solar energy is exciting. But isn't Trump fighting against the development of clean energy? It's true that our current president said that he believes the sound of wind turbines causes cancer.
If you have a windmill anywhere near your house, congratulations. They say the noise causes cancer.
And Donald Trump did issue an executive order ending Biden-era subsidies for clean energy.
We're ending Joe Biden's war on beautiful, clean coal once and for all.
So yes, Trump is trying to protect the fossil fuel industry donors who reportedly spent nearly $500 million boosting his presidential campaign. Perhaps that's why Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill gives oil and gas companies an additional $40 billion of public money in the form of tax credits over the next 10 years, on top of the $30 billion they're already getting. But despite all of that, the solar energy revolution now looks poised to overpower Trump and the fossil fuel industry.
A thing that's both big and good enough that it might start to grapple with a lot of the traumas that we're experiencing in the Trump era.
So how exactly is this happening? How is solar energy suddenly now a viable, cost-effective challenger to fossil fuels? To answer those questions, I began my conversation with Bill McKibben at the very beginning of the story of solar energy. So I want to start off with you about at the very beginning, a very rudimentary question. What is a solar cell and when was it invented?
Solar cell is a way to take the power of the nuclear reactions on the sun, all those hydrogen atoms turning into helium atoms, and convert them directly into electricity. This somewhat miraculous piece of technology was invented in 1954 at Bell Labs. Your parents and mine funded this work by dropping dimes in payphones across America over the decades. And since then, it has grown cheaper and cheaper and cheaper year after year. Sometime earlier this decade, it passed some invisible line where it became the cheapest way of making power on the planet. And so now it stands a good chance of ending the 700,000-year-old human habit of setting stuff on fire when we want to get work done.
Let's get our listeners situated with the state of solar power right now. After the solar cell was developed in 1954, how did the technology accelerate and what slowed its acceleration so that it didn't yet until recent years become a kind of mass scale energy system that it now can be?
So at first it's so expensive you can only use it for satellites, but the cost starts to come down. And the first indication that it could play a big role comes in the 1970s during the oil crises. Jimmy Carter seizes on it as the future. And in his last budget, had he been reelected in the year 1980, the budget called for enough spending to guarantee that America would be producing 20% of its power from the sun by the year 2000.
President Jimmy Carter believed so strongly in solar energy that he had solar panels installed on the White House. Here's Carter in 1979.
We're taking the energy that God gave us, the most renewable energy that we will ever see, and using it to replace our dwindling supplies of fossil fuels. This strong federal commitment to solar energy will be sustained year after year after year after year.
Needless to say, that didn't happen because Jimmy Carter was beaten in that election by Ronald Reagan, who tore the solar panels off the roof and declared that it was morning in America again, but not a sunrise, dawn kind of morning, a drill all you want without any regard to the environment kind of morning.
Right. Asterisk elections matter.
Exactly right. And so we end up on the route to really runaway climate change. The next great political intervention happens not in the US, but in Germany. Right around the turn of the century, the German Greens, again proving that elections matter, end up holding the balance of power in their parliamentary system. They use it to exact the promise of what the Germans call the Energiewende, the energy transition. German government agreed to pay a high price to people who put solar panels on their roofs for the power they were producing. The German taxpayer bought, in essence, a lot of expensive solar energy. And this was the thing that enabled the Chinese to start getting very good at building these panels. They've gotten better and better and better with each passing year. We passed this invisible line 4 or 5 years ago, at which point this stuff becomes cheaper than coal and gas and oil. And that's a completely epochal moment for human civilization, one whose implications we haven't understood yet. And the thing I heard from people everywhere, including people quite enmeshed in this world, was, I had no idea how fast this was coming. This is not just the fastest growing energy source at the moment, it's the fastest growing energy source in human history, and by a large margin. It's, in the matter of 36 months, begun to transform, especially in China, but increasingly in much of the rest of the world, our relationship, the human relationship with energy.
You know, I think people think about the idea that science or technology will save us. They think about it kind of in cinematic terms, like there's this aha moment and then like the world changes overnight. The story you're telling is a story of a technology, at this point, frankly, an old technology, becoming more developable at a mass scale in a way that there wasn't necessarily really an aha moment. Like we had these tools and we just decided, or various things happened to converge to get us to use them properly.
Suddenly, the cost of them is no longer standing in the way. And so they're being deployed at scale. And now, and here's the interesting political part of the story, especially for Americans, the fossil fuel industry, watching this spectacle take place, is transfixed and decides it better play the political game for all it's worth. Here's the key statistic, I think. California, fourth largest economy in the world, did a good job of building this stuff out, such that they reached a tipping point sometime in the last year or two. Now, most days, California supplies more than 100% of its power from renewable energy for much of the day. At night, therefore, the biggest source of supply to the grid is often batteries that have been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon. That means that California, fourth largest economy in the world, is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity than it was 2 years ago. 40% less fossil fuel in the fourth largest economy in 2 years' time is the kind of number that actually starts to knock tenths of a degree off how hot the world eventually gets. It's spectacularly good news unless you own oil wells or coal mines, in which case it's spectacularly bad news. If I was noticing this number, then I'm operating in the assumption that people at Exxon and Chevron might have noticed it too, and that's the reason why, when President Trump said, as candidate Trump this time last year, give me $1 billion and you can have anything you want, I think that might be why the oil industry jumped so high to do as he asked, and are now being rewarded with a truly unprecedented set of federal efforts to slow down this energy transition. It's insane in every way. David, it's not that China is eating our lunch. It's that we've sent a red-capped crew of waiters over to serve our lunch to the Chinese. I mean, it could not be more absurd to take technology originally invented here and just absolutely deliver it to the group that is theoretically, according to Trump, our major adversary in the world. We're just handing them the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy just on the business side, right? I mean, just forget about whether you want to clean up the environment. It's just on a straight up business idea that we are going to just allow our competitor sort of unchallenged.
So the IRA under Biden was the attempt to challenge that.
Right.
To give the U.S. a foothold in this race for the future. What's really funny now, of course, is that Trump took office on day one declaring an energy emergency. And the energy emergency was we needed much more energy to fuel this fleet of data centers that are setting sail across the good sea, artificial intelligence, Whether or not we actually need a zillion data centers, I think is actually a highly open question. But if we're actually going to build them with electricity in some kind of timely manner to keep us ahead of the Chinese in the AI competition, then the only thing we've got to build them with is sun and wind and batteries. It takes forever to put up, forget nuclear power plants, putting up a gas-fired power plant is a 4 or 5 year odyssey, but you can build solar farms almost literally overnight. In May, the Chinese were putting up 3 gigawatts of solar power a day. A gigawatt is the rough equivalent of a coal-fired power plant. So they were building one of those with solar panels every 8 hours.
And I think what you're articulating is not necessarily that the Chinese government is concerned environmentally. This is not like an out of the goodness of their own heart kind of thing. This is like a business investment. And I think that requires kind of a thinking shift. I mean, we're old enough to know that solar forever used to be this thing that was kind of eye-rolled as this like thing for hippies. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, you want to clean up the environment. That's nice for you. But it's not really necessarily like a serious business.
Right.
So the Chinese are not the Lorax here.
That's right. I mean, in truth, in any sensible world, slowing down climate change is an extremely sound business decision.
For sure.
Because it's going to put us out of business. Just Google the words climate and insurance if you want to understand why any rational economy would be doing everything it could. But yes, the Chinese, though they do fear climate change, and they were very worried about the pollution of their cities and the political illegitimacy it was causing the Communist Party, the Chinese are doing this as an effort to rule the key technologies of the coming century, and in the process to achieve a kind of political hegemony. If the biggest question on Earth for the next 50 years is going to be how do we survive the climate crisis, then China is going to be the leading interlocutor in that question. I mean, we're going to have the first global climate conference in Brazil in November that doesn't feature the United States. It won't be there. And I think the Chinese are just licking their chops at that prospect. But the good news here is that there is a lot that we can continue to do, even with Trump and his henchmen, sort of mustache twirling henchmen in power. There's a lot that we can continue to do at the state and local level. And it begins with, and here's where I think the most important thing you said was about the kind of the hippie eye rolling that goes with solar energy. We spent 40 years calling this stuff alternative energy.
Right.
And that came at a cost. Eventually, it was sort of ghettoized in our mind into this. It's not anymore. We live on a planet where the obvious, common sense, straightforward way to build new energy is with the sun and the wind. And this spring, the oil industry tried in the Texas state legislature to enact a series of policies, much like the Trump people have done in Washington, to slow down renewable energy. In fact, the sort of leading bill that everyone expected to pass was described as DEI for natural gas. If you wanted to build 5 megawatts of solar, you had to build 5 megawatts of gas too. Well, People emerged out of the woodwork, mostly from rural Texas, to the legislature to say, hang on, boys, this is the way that we, pay our taxes here in rural county X. This is what keeps the school system going. This is, why we still have an old folks home. Don't do this. And the Texas legislature backed off. I think they decided it was, more fun to try and redistrict or whatever they're going to do instead. But for the next 2 years, they're going to leave this stuff alone because it had reached some point of political entrenchment. We're trying very hard. September 21st is Sun Day, not Earth Day, but Sun Day. It's going to be a nationwide kind of celebration of renewable energy. Some places it'll be angry protest against new gas pipelines. Everywhere, it will be an effort to drive home the notion that this is not alternative energy, that this is the energy that makes sense going forward.
Coming up next, I ask Bill McKibben to size up the opposition to the solar revolution. Are there any valid arguments against solar energy? And who exactly is fighting to delay the solar wave? That's after the break. Welcome back to Lever Time.
I want to talk a little bit about arguments for and against, because we've been talking a lot about for, but there's also a technological argument for solar that we haven't touched on, which I've always, I guess, kind of wondered about. The question of how much more efficient solar panels are than fossil fuels at the kind of molecular level, at the level of how much energy it actually produces. And I preface this question by saying, I always assumed, obviously wrongly, as you're about to tell us, I always assumed that we used fossil fuels because it must produce more energy per molecule of fossil fuels. It would produce more energy in comparison to solar, and therefore that's probably somehow why we chose to build a fossil fuel economy. In fact, what you describe in your book is that it's actually the mirror opposite at like an unbelievable level. Just for people who don't know how much more efficient on the molecular level solar energy is than fossil fuel energy, like walk them through that.
So it's extremely efficient because it's direct. You're getting electricity directly, and electricity is super valuable. Put electricity into an EV, and you get 5 times the efficiency of putting gas into a car, because most of the gas, when you burn it, is just producing waste heat. If you were setting out now to build an energy system, here's what fossil fuel looks like. You have to know how to go drill miles under the ocean or explode the subsurface geology to frack gas. You have to collect it, somehow get it to your massive refinery where you separate it into products, get it out to, say, a gas station, pump it into, have the technology to pump it into the tank of a car, which then needs thousands of moving parts to perform the difficult task of millions of explosions of pistons inside cylinders to drive the car forward. Or, like at my house, you could have solar panels with a cord that connects them to the front of the car, which has 20 moving parts. That's it. End of story. Here we go. We're going to use much less what we call primary energy by the time we make this transition to renewable electricity. And then the second half of this is, as we get this clean electricity, we need the heat pumps and the EVs and the induction cooktops to use it. And that's the other place where Donald Trump et al. Are trying to deliver the future to the Chinese. America's auto industry is not going to exist in a few years on this trend because the Chinese now know how to build good cars for $10,000. If Donald Trump thinks that the rest of the world is going to line up to buy, I don't know, Cadillac Escalades or something, I mean, he is crazy. So, what am I telling you?
I mean, there's this stat. It takes 2 to 3 times more energy to run a standard car than to run an EV. 2 to 3 more times. The e-bike, as you write, is almost unbelievably efficient. To fully charge a 500-watt e-bike costs on average about 8 cents. 8 cents for 30 miles of range.
The e-bike may be the greatest invention of this whole. We're selling far more of them than EVs, of course, around the world. And look, a bicycle is good technology to begin with, but essentially we've now invented a bicycle that has no hills,
Right.
and if you think about it, that's one of the sweetest inventions there ever was. So the possibilities here are remarkable and remarkably beautiful. It's not just that we have a different way of generating power that will do less damage to the climate, though that's the reason that we have no choice but to do this fast. But, the other benefits start to add up. Think what the geopolitics of planet Earth would have looked like over the last 70 years if oil was not a valuable commodity. What wars, coups, and assorted idiocy would we have avoided? Human beings are good at coming up with reasons to fight wars, but they will struggle to figure out how to fight one over sunshine.
Let's talk about what the counter arguments are. What I hear you portraying is a Trump administration that is corrupt.
Yes.
Basically, the corruption, Trump got a lot of money from fossil fuel industry donors. He sees that as his base. He's delivering for his base by trying to slow down the energy transition. I'm not really interested in counter arguments from him. I don't think he's making serious arguments, but some people try to make serious arguments. What are some of the arguments that you think have been the most effective?
Yeah, I'd say the two arguments that are most effective because they tend to deflect progressives off from full-hearted support here. Conservatives, they've tried their best to just, coal is manly, that's the way the argument goes. But for progressives, it's like, well, there's a lot of mining associated with this, and that will be bad. Look, no free lunch, only more expensive and less expensive lunches.
We're talking about rare earth minerals.
Lithium. But if you think about it for 5 minutes, you quickly grasp the distinction. You mine some lithium, you stick it in a battery, there it does its job for the next 25 years. When the battery's degraded, you recycle the lithium out and start over again. The Rocky Mountain Institute last year said we'd have less mining for the battery transition between now and 2050 than we mined coal last year. A way to think about it in your head, David, just to picture it is, imagine a boatload of solar panels coming from, say, China to the US. In its lifetime, that boatload of solar panels will produce 500 times as much energy as a boatload of coal coming from someplace. And the other one is, isn't it going to use up all our nice land to do this? And this, I think, finally, people are starting to figure out. It's one of my favorite parts of writing the book was to try and explain how badly we've misconceived. In this country, our biggest crop use for land is corn. 30 million acres, about half the corn land in the country, is used for growing ethanol, gasoline. It's unbelievably inefficient. I was at a field in Illinois last summer with a guy who was a farmer who was making the transition of part of his land. He said, look, here's an acre. It's in corn used for ethanol. That'll produce enough ethanol to drive my Ford F-150 25,000 miles. When I cover that same acre in solar panels, I get enough electricity to drive my Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV version of the same truck, not 25,000 miles, but 700,000 miles. All kinds of room in between the rows in that solar farm to do endlessly interesting things. We live on an overheated planet where shade is an increasingly important commodity, and here's a good economic way to produce it. It's good for the animals that want to lie down in it. It's good for the crops that would like the moisture it helps retain. There was a study I just saw about French grape varieties, a 60% increase in yields in fields with solar panels. In Vermont, where I live, we're increasingly using it to plant pollinator-friendly plantings to attract native pollinating insects, which have been decimated in the biodiversity crisis we're undergoing. They're back by orders of magnitude, and what that means is that for farmers around these solar farms, we're getting 30 and 40% increases in fruit set and pollination because those critters are back at work. So this is a different way of looking at the landscape. For those of us who live in rural America, it offers extraordinary possibilities for getting away from the just scourge of monoculture commodity agriculture above all, and it provides farmers with a steady income of a kind that they could use. Clean electrons are a great crop.
I had seen, just to follow on your point, I had seen that there's a proposal in California of covering their water canals with solar panels, which would prevent the evaporation of the water that is flowing through the canals. I mean, like you couldn't wave a wand and create a better synergy there.
Yeah.
What about the idea that we've sort of heard it from the Trump administration? I think the Secretary of Energy suggested that the problem with renewable energies like solar and wind is that they're not always on.
Yeah, it's at least reassuring that the Secretary of Energy has noticed that the sun goes down at night. So that's, that's good. And the answer to this is contained in one word: batteries. And batteries have gotten cheap at the same astonishing rate as the solar and wind that they're storing. They're getting cheaper by the day. The new offer in China, the new tender offer in their last big round of bidding for batteries, came in at about 40% under what it had the year before. Partly that's because there are now Chinese cars on the market that don't use lithium-ion batteries. They use sodium-ion batteries. Sodium, i.e. salt, i.e. the fifth most common element on planet Earth, i.e. cheaper than roughly the same price as dirt. So the possibilities here are endless.
We're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, I ask Bill McKibben if it's already too late for solar power to stop our march towards climate disaster. Welcome back to Lever Time.
The International Energy Agency estimates that if we're to keep on the climate track set out in the Paris Agreement in 2015, heading for a net zero world by 2050, we need to increase the pace at which we're installing renewables by about 20%. So you've laid out that we are making incredible progress as a planet right now. So the question then becomes, okay, how do we speed up this transition?
So I think it's about 50% that they've said we need to increase it by, which is hard, but it's not 5,000%, it's a doable number. And so there are lots of ways to do that. I mean, the most obvious, straightforward, sensible way would be for the world to decide, let's spend a little money to make sure that the developing world can get access to this stuff right away, because they need it badly, and it's because where the growth is coming and so on. Obviously, the U.S. isn't going to participate in that going forward, but the Chinese are, and they're spreading this stuff quickly around the world. In this country, one big way to speed things up that we're talking about a lot as we approach Sunday is to make it much easier to permit it. If you want to put solar panels on your rooftop, and you should, it costs you 3 times as much as it does in Australia or the EU. Not 30% more, 3 times as much. A little bit of that's because the tariffs on solar panels, but most of it's because we have a Byzantine and Baroque permitting system where there are 15,000 municipalities, each with their own building codes, inspectors climbing all over your roof, on and on and on, none of which the rest of the world has decided that they any longer need. Happily, there's an app developed by the National Renewable Energy Lab that allows for instant solar permitting. It's called Solar App Plus. California, Maryland, and New Jersey have now mandated its use. We want to spread that across the country. For people who live in apartments and don't have a rooftop to control, across Europe over the last couple of years, this thing called balcony solar has taken off like a rocket. There are 3 million Germans now who have gone to whatever the German Best Buy is and come home with a solar panel and hung it from their railing. And they're now producing, in many cases, 20%, 25% of the energy that they use just by plugging it into the wall. This is illegal everywhere in the U.S., except in that progressive bastion, the desert state of Utah, where the state legislature unanimously passed the enabling legislation this spring because one libertarian state senator stood up and said, why can the people in Hamburg and Frankfurt do this and not the good people of Provo and Salt Lake City.
Well, what is actually the answer? Why?
There is no answer. I mean, because Underwriters Laboratory has never gotten around to rating these things and whatever. But we're an emergency. And it's not like this stuff is dangerous. I mean, A, the Germans are not exactly loosey-goosey about rules and regulations. And B, if there were millions of German apartments catching fire from the solar panels on their balcony, you can rest assured that Fox News would have been covering this in some detail. So it shouldn't be any harder than plugging a refrigerator into your wall. These are the kind of things, given that we're not going to have in the short run federal support for renewable energy, these are the things we need to be doing, and we are doing at Sunday.
I want to talk about some big takeaways here. It seems one thing that becomes clear is that this build out of solar has not happened until market forces change. It hasn't happened at the level we're talking about. And what I wonder is whether we're not going to ultimately address climate change frontally on its own merits. I wonder if one of the tales here is that because the solar build out is happening essentially on economic terms, such terms that places like Texas are embracing it, right? Not exactly as we've discussed, hippy dippy land. If the build out is happening because of economics, first and foremost, not because of the climate emergency, and that the climate benefits are sort of secondary, what is the lesson from that for the larger climate movement?
Well, so in the first place, remember that it's only because we had consistent activism that we got a lot of those cost savings. That's what drove the demand that produced the engineering. So there's something there. But it is a huge opportunity for the climate movement. We spent 35 years laboring in a world where fossil fuel was cheap and renewables were expensive. Remember how much effort was devoted to the important task of trying to make fossil fuel more expensive with carbon taxes, by divestment to reduce their flow of capital, by stopping their expansion through new pipelines and things like that. Now we have the economic wind at our back, as it were. And so it should be a moment when we take that momentum, that work that we've been doing for decades, and apply it to this task, which comes with all these other benefits. We haven't even talked about the fact that 9 million people a year on this planet die, 1 death in 5, from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. If you've been to Delhi recently, that number won't shock you, but there's hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma in this country from breathing those particulates. And we know who gets to live next to the refinery and out by the highway and stuff. So it's a huge justice issue too. This is a real important, interesting moment. We haven't had a technological project that even resembles this since the moonshot in the 60s. And that was actually a kind of unifying national thing in the middle of a chaotic and divisive period. But this is a much better one because it's not about landing 2 guys on the moon. It's about bringing our local star down to Earth and using it to preserve the beauty of this place we were born onto. It could be a national and a global unifying project if we chose to. And the fact that the main force in the way of that happening right now is our village moron Donald Trump should give you some sense of just what a great possibility this will be in the immediate future. I hope it's one of the things that people who are opposing him seize on as a method of resistance, because it's clearly, along with immigration and tariffs, the single biggest underwriting thread of his presidency.
Do you think Donald Trump and the Trump movement, if they continue to be in power, do you think they can stop the trend and the revolution in energy that you've described?
They can't stop it globally. I think, in fact, they're speeding it up globally, because I think all across the world, rulers are looking around and saying, do I want to depend on the U.S. and its liquefied natural gas for my supply of energy, or is this a kind of fickle and erratic state on which to rest my hopes? Perhaps I should follow the Chinese route and build a lot of solar panels. Indonesia just announced last week 100 gigawatts of new solar construction. Maybe they can slow it down here a lot. I mean, they can definitely slow it down, and they already are. You can build a world where 15 years out, the US is a kind of colonial Williamsburg of internal combustion where people from around the world arrive to gawp at how the people did things in the olden days. I imagine we'll start trying to catch up at some point, because if we don't, the penalty of paying a lot extra for energy for decades to come is going to turn us into an economic basket case compared to almost everybody else on the planet. So I imagine we'll start trying to play catch up at some point, but it's going to take some work to make that happen. That's why some part of me wishes that we could just relax and let market forces do their thing, but there's probably more work for activists than there's ever been.
Final question, and I say this with really deep love and respect for you. You're one of my role models and journalistic heroes, I think in part because I sense that we share a similar sense of like simultaneous pessimism and optimism. to use the don't look up metaphor a bit, we see the incoming asteroid of climate change and we feel that sense of pessimism that maybe we can't stop it. And yet we also know that we're not, or we don't accept that we're at the end of that movie. Our fate is not sealed.
Yep.
You've written that it's now too late to stop global warming, but you're arguing here that solar could effectively prevent the worst case scenarios among all the other benefits of it. My question here is, how and why do you have hope that this time is going to be different than, say, back in the 1970s when there seemed to be, we were on the precipice of making the big investments when Jimmy Carter made that real push and it ultimately didn't happen? What is different about this moment culturally, politically, economically?
So politically and culturally, we may have regressed from the 1970s. We're in the ugliest period of our national political life that I've ever lived through, and I was old enough to be around in the 1970s. Economically, solar power is 100th the cost it was in the 1970s. The argument for it is overwhelming and extremely real. But it also still produces, at some level, some of that beautiful vibe, too, of an earlier day. Look, I took the title for this book from George Harrison, and, it turns out that Here Comes the Sun is the most streamed by far of all the songs in the Beatles' vast catalog. There are 500 other great songs about the sun out there, as we're discovering as we put together Spotify playlists for Sunday. Just on and on and on, you name it. If you try to establish a similar playlist for odes to fracked gas, is not very deep. Energy from heaven, not from hell. This is somehow deeply corresponds with the human desire. We have the most charismatic object in our universe. It gives us warmth and light and photosynthesis. It's now willing to give us all the power we could ever need. We're at a very cool moment. Let's see if we can try and push ourselves over this nice cliff for once.
I love how you describe it, because it just reminds me of this conversation I had with my kids recently, where I traced how basically everything on the planet comes from the sun. Like literally everything is like 2 or 3 degrees away from that fruit you're eating, yeah, that came from the sun. Like everything comes from the sun. And now having our energy system come from the sun, I'm literally getting like chills, like thinking about it. Like everything comes from that thing, that ball of light up there. And you're right. It really is something we can unify around. And I am feeling the optimism right now. I really am.
Good. Well, join us on Sunday, because we got a lot of resisting to do in the way of getting towards where we need to go. But we've got something to work for. And it's the first thing in the 40 years I've been doing this that even comes close to scaling in the way we need it to do.
Bill McKibben's new book is called Here Comes the Sun, A Last Chance for the Climate and a Fresh Chance for Civilization. He's also the author of bestsellers like The End of Nature, Falter, and Deep Economy. He's founder of Third Act, a project organizing people over 60 for progressive change. Bill, thank you for being on the show. Thank you for doing the work you do. Thank you for being a role model. And thank you really for being you. Thank you.
Well, back at you, brother, and thank you for keeping up the work over and over again, you and your whole team. It's exactly what we need.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by Ariella Markowitz. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. Our theme music is by Nick Campbell. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. For ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please consider becoming a premium subscriber. Head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber, or click the link in this episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.